I don't use words like deep state, very often, but this made me think there is an entrenched bureaucracy, and the Biden administration did everything it could to empower it before he left office.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Tuesday, February 18th. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined by Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief, and Phil Wegmann, our White House correspondent. Gentlemen, let's start with the biggest news of the day by far is the talks that have taken place, begun in Saudi Arabia. We had Marco Rubio lead a small American delegation sitting down with Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, along with a couple of his folks to discuss, relations between the United States and Russia and the ending of the Ukraine war. Carl, I'm going to start with you on this. Vladimir Zelensky angrily canceled his trip to Saudi Arabia that was scheduled for Wednesday and said, look, this can't happen behind closed doors. It can't happen without the principles. We're never going to agree to anything, unless we're part of the discussion. So what do you make of these initial beginnings of talks that, both sides say they want to lead to the end of the war?
Look, you can understand why a new administration would want to take the temperature of Vladimir Putin without his adversary. This guy invaded Ukraine, so without them there, you'd understand that. But it's been presented, and not just in the media, by people in administration itself, as the beginning of peace talks. Well, how are you going to have peace talks without Ukraine there? I mean, the mind boggles. I was thinking of historic analogies, and the ones I came up with are not very flattering to the Trump administration. Neville Chamberlain talking to Hitler about Czechoslovakia, which he then swallowed whole. If these are actual peace talks, Ukraine has to be involved, and I think everyone understands that.
Well, Phil, Marco Rubio did say, Secretary of State said, look, nobody's getting sidelined here. This is just the initial, beginnings of peace talks. What are your sources telling you from the administration side as far as how they see these talks going? And is there a plan at some point to bring Ukraine into these discussions?
Yeah, Ukraine will certainly be at the table. There's going to be three players here: the United States, Russia, and of course, Ukraine. My question to the administration last week was whether or not Europe would also have a seat at the table, given that this administration is pushing them to be more responsible for their own security. That hasn't been fleshed out just yet, but I think that Cannon's point is the accurate one here, right? Even if this is a dress rehearsal for larger negotiations, Ukraine is signaling that they're the ones who have skin in the game right now, that they're the ones who are actually involved in this kind of trench warfare. I think that this would be a more alarming trend if we hadn't heard from the White House that Zelensky and Kiev are going to put their thumb on the scale in the future. But what I think is so interesting in all of this is the location of these peace talks. It's in Saudi Arabia. And what did we hear from President Trump at the World Economic Forum just a few weeks ago? Well, he sort of issued an implicit threat when he said that if Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations increased production of oil, that would basically bring Russia to its knees. So I don't know if that's one of the back channel negotiations going on here, but it's something to watch as well.
Carl, how do you see these talks proceeding, and what's going to be, do you think, the eventual outcome? I mean, there's it looks like NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table. Maybe that'll come back at some point, but
yeah, but that's what alarms Zelensky. These talks. I mean, Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense, sort of gave away the store, and I use that phrase. Old Reagan hands will remember it. When Reagan went to Reykjavik, Bill Plant, I think it was, the great CBS correspondent, yelled at Reagan as he was walking to meet Gorby, and the conservatives were then pushing hard against this. They didn't want Reagan negotiating with the Ruskies, and Bill Plant said, "Are you going to give away the store?" And Reagan very definitely said, "I don't own the store." Well, so this idea, and they played it very close to the best. This idea that you negotiate and you have this, this new Secretary of Defense sort of blurt out, they can't keep their territory and they can't be in NATO. That should have been what the United States held out for. And this amateurish approach to negotiations alarmed Zelensky. I think it alarmed a lot of Americans too. So I think, Tom, I think that's one of the reasons the Ukrainians are so upset by this, is because it followed that word salad by Hegseth. The outlines of a deal have never been clear to me. President Trump seems to think that they're clear. He's said many times, that he's suggested this is not a difficult thing. He always prefaces by saying this war would never have happened if I was president, which I don't know why he says that, but at this point, it's neither here nor there. The war's going on now, and he is president. He promised, to end it before he took office. Nobody really believed that. And he said on day one, well, now this is, pretty timely. He's been president not yet a month, and he's trying to negotiate an end to this. If he can do it, people will have to give him credit. But what that deal consists of and whether the Ukrainians will accept it now is what everybody wants to know.
Phil, you mentioned the Europeans, and they kind of freaked out last week when JD Vance went over to the Munich Security Conference and sort of upbraided them to their faces about free speech and trying to promote the shared values that we have. And then Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, immediately called it an emergency meeting they had to have so that they could figure out
how to respond to JD Vance.
Yeah, and how to sort of, I guess, reorient themselves to the Trump administration. What is the administration's view toward Europe? You mentioned they want to see him obviously take more responsibility for their own security, but what's the relationship like now between this administration and our European allies? Obviously strained, or is it more than that? Was there some sort of fundamental breach here that happened last week?
I would think the safest thing to say is that it is strained, and I think that look no further than who is negotiating with the Russians. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, both of these guys have long said that the focus of America's strategic defense should be in the Indo-Pacific, that the real threat to the United States is a rising China, and they've wanted to shift the emphasis from Europe and from Russia to Beijing. So it's no surprise that they are eager to get off of this conflict and prepare for one that they see as more existential. In terms of the Europeans, again, this seems to be a case of them not taking Donald Trump at his word, of them not taking him seriously. And it turns out all of the things that he said he was going to do, he has. And notably in this entire discussion, I don't think that we should lose sight of the fact that Trump has also said that he thinks that this coziness between Ukraine and NATO, the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, was likely the impetus for the start of this war. So we're going to see a reconfiguration, not just of our relationship with Europe, I think, in the coming years, but also how that continent, how the old world does business.
Cannon, we've got just a couple minutes left in this segment, and I want to touch on another important event that took place this week in global affairs, and that was the U.S. whooping up on Canada in this friendly match that took place. And obviously, no love lost when the Canadians booed our national anthem. And I saw Justin Trudeau had said, he tweeted, "Oh, I'm so proud of the Canadians," and a picture of the stadium. And I saw one of the funniest things I saw. Someone tweeted, "We're not going to let Canada become the 51st state until they learn how to play hockey," which I thought was one. What about this, Carl? What about this?
That is next level
international incident that took place.
What do Canadians pride themselves on more than hockey? I don't know. They taught the world hockey, but in this case, they lost the fight and they lost the game, and they're losing the argument. You booing the national anthem, that is not. It wasn't Donald Trump they booed. They booed our song. And a couple weeks ago, we had a little mini debate broke out among you, me, and Andy about the national anthem. And watching those American hockey players kick the crap out of the Canadians over the song, I'm revisiting my position. I don't think we can change the national anthem. I think we have to keep that song now.
Okay, news has been made here. Phil, you get the last word on this. It was pretty amazing to see these brothers, the Chuck brothers, like drop their gloves immediately after
One
the fight.
second, 1 second after the
I
fight.
mean,
Yeah.
that is not
Yeah.
something you see in any other sport.
Yeah, I mean, apparently they were planning to do this even before the Canucks, booed our national anthem, and I think that made it even worse for them. So, the Canadians, they ought to just stick to maple syrup and being nice and not booing our song because it's a banger and it's the best.
So, Tom,
right.
one more word. The old line did come to mind. Yeah, I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out.
All right. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with more Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, speaking with Carl Cannon and Phil Wegmann. Phil, I'll start with you this segment. We have the ongoing battle with Elon Musk and Democrats and the media about trying to shrink the size and scope of the government. And there was a report that Elon Musk has found 4.7 trillion with a T trillion in payments that were made that were untraceable. Like, we don't know where the money went. How is that possible? What exactly did Elon's team find, and how is it possible that $5 trillion, more or less, I mean, who's counting, could go missing?
So the DOGE report here is that essentially what was happening over at the Social Security Bureau was that they were not earmarking using the correct bookkeeping tag here to explain where these payments were going. And thus the $4.7 trillion is now untraceable in retrospect. We'll have to see if that's actually, a scandal here or just sloppy bookkeeping. But I think that the public, as they look at such large numbers, are going to come to a conclusion, which is the government rule of large numbers is that eventually when you're dealing with that many zeros, there's got to be some fraud somewhere. The reason why I'm taking it with a grain of salt right now, though, is what we saw from Elon Musk just over the weekend is he claimed that there were some individuals who are over 100 years old who were still getting Social Security benefits. Some folks who, according to a chart that he tweeted, were more than 120 years old. Well, what we found out was that there was a 2023 IG report which showed that some of those folks who are still in the Social Security system are only in the Social Security system because they do not have proof of death. But that doesn't mean that payments are going out. All of that to say, there's a lot of smoke. And there's going to be a lot of questions asked about what was actually happening there. But Elon Musk has got to tread lightly because the American public, they were not going to get up in arms over US aid. They're absolutely going to get up in arms over a government agency that sends checks to their loved ones. So I think everything before this was a warm up. Now this is going to get serious, and this could be peril for Elon Musk if he doesn't handle it correctly.
Carl, do you agree with that? Is Social Security a different kettle of fish, and that unlike millions of dollars for drag shows in South America or something, this is a lot closer to home, and people are not going to take kindly to Elon Musk futzing with their Social Security?
Well, both President Biden and Donald Trump during the campaign said it was sacrosanct. They took it off the table. It was the only thing they agreed on, and they both demagogued on it. The fact of the matter is, if this country is going to have a balanced budget or anything approaching a balanced budget, the entitlement programs are going to have to be looked at. They're going to either in Social Security, it's not that complicated. You've got 3 or 4 options. You can delay the retirement age. You can raise the money that goes into it. You can cap the COLAs, the cost of living increases, or reduce them, or maybe even in this case, maybe freeze them for a year if it was an emergency. Or you can find fraud. Fraud's the easy one to talk about, but that's not going to solve this problem. Well, people who are getting $2,000 a month, living been retired for many years, want the world's richest man screwing with their paycheck. I'm with Phil. No, they won't. On the other hand,
But
if this administration is serious, we're running $1 trillion deficits in peacetime. That's unsustainable and obscene. So
but
entitlements are
Phil,
going to have to be part of that. If he can, if these guys can find a way to address this problem, if they find fraud and eliminate it, if they engage with the Democrats in negotiations to make this program solve it, I think the American people, I think the American people are much more mature and thoughtful about these kinds of things than the average elected official.
Phil, we had the acting head of the Social Security Administration resign. She was actually replaced and then resigned, and we had stories come out saying she
Wait, she was replaced and then she resigned?
Yeah,
it's like that old Mary
actually.
Tyler Moore show. She says she gets so frustrated. She says, "You can't quit me. I'm fired."
But and apparently she said that she resigned because she was uncomfortable with Elon Musk being able to access all of the personal information, personal details of that system. We also have the same concerns being raised over at the IRS. Democrats are accusing Elon Musk of wanting to, getting his hands on all of this super sensitive information, which I'm sure. Listen, every advertiser in America probably has more information on all of us than they know what to do with. And I saw Elon tweeted something. He said, "Listen, if I want to get people's, private information, I could have done that at PayPal. Duh." So who's going to win this battle, this framing battle? Are people really concerned? Does the privacy issue resonate with people enough to give the Democrats an upper hand in sort of the narrative on this stuff?
Yeah, it's an interesting cultural question when so many of us never read any terms and services and just hit agree with
Exactly. We give our
every
stuff
app
away,
constantly. And look at what the younger generation was saying about TikTok. They were saying, give China my information, but don't take away my algorithm. So yes, I think that there's a possibility of this being overblown, over privacy. On the other hand, though, it is very significant, this data, because while Elon Musk was the head of PayPal, Elon Musk is also someone who is aware of the promise of AI, of the promise of these massive learning systems that once they have access to so much data, then they can remake the world. Obviously, it's not something that he's doing now, but you could see a scenario, perhaps a year or two or less in the future, where someone like Elon Musk says the way to fix the federal government is to replace a lot of the federal workforce with artificial intelligence. The way to sort through all of this is to feed it through an algorithm. And oh, by the way, who is going to provide that algorithm? That's a bit of speculation here. That said, I think that gets to some of the concerns. I also think it's worth noting Michelle King, the administrator who was fired and or resigned. If you look at her LinkedIn for over a decade, I mean, she's a lifer at Social Security. She's been there for more than 30 years.
30
but for
years,
over
yep.
a decade, her mission, her mandate was to go after fraud. Now Elon Musk is showing up and saying that fraud runs, rampant. So I think we're going to learn more about the story.
Carl, one of the first of all, Phil just teed you up to complain about Skynet and AI. Again, if you want to do that, feel free.
No, I just duly noted it's the end of the human race. But
Okay.
let's keep going.
But these clips have been circulating, and Elon Musk circulated them, and Carolyn Levitt, the White House press secretary, circulated them as well, of none other than Barack Obama himself saying that he was going to go through, his administration was going to go through the budget line by line and program by program to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. And that other administrations had talked about it. He made it a promise on the campaign trail. He was going to fulfill that. We also have clips from Bill Clinton and his reinventing government and the fact that he used buyouts to trim the workforce at that point in time. So, given that kind of context, historical context put on the current activities of this administration, makes it seem like, you know what, it's nothing new under the sun here. So why is everybody freaking out?
Well, because it's Trump is the short answer, and now Elon Musk. But Tom, your point is right, and I think that the privacy arguments being used in a sense are red herring. We heard this at the Treasury Department. They're going to go through and this was the first one, and they went to court and they won a a preliminary injunction to stop it from a very respected judge who's not a, appointed by Democratic appointee, but a very respected judge who's never displayed bias before. And he said, this is a problem. And the Democrats must think it's a winning issue. They keep talking about the privacy aspect. It must poll well or focus group test well. But when hearing Phil talk, I realized there may be a generational divide here. You've got these 80-year-old Democrats shrieking about privacy. They didn't care about it before, but now they do care about it. Okay, there's a double standard, but that's typical of both parties. But Phil's saying, you got a whole two generations, millennials and Gen Zs, who they long ago thought privacy was probably out the window. But Elon Musk going through these things, he's not elected. He's not confirmed by any, he's just kind of there. It's not a Senate confirmable position. He's never been in politics before. There is some unrest with his role.
You'd feel more comfortable if he had been in politics? That would make this better?
I wasn't speaking for myself necessarily.
Okay.
But you mentioned these other cases. The Rigo I covered closely, reinventing government. Al Gore was put in charge of it. They had people come in and they didn't go through people's. It was a little different. We were talking about individuals' privacy, but they went through the government. And Elaine Kmark was one of the people brought in. She's a scholar. She's at Brookings and has taught at Harvard. And they got rid of what was like $3 billion in waste, which was then considered a significant amount of money. Today now we give $3 billion in COVID payments to inmates. I mean, we just lost the plot. But people always, there was a process. What's going on now? It just seems that there's no process. It's just the seat of the pants with this guy who's undeniably brilliant, but there are things he doesn't know about government. How could he?
But yeah, and to Cannon's point here, look at what happened at the Department of Energy, where they fired more than 100 probationary employees, then had to immediately turn around and rehire them. On a computer screen, it's likely that those individuals who were fired looked like they were superfluous, that they didn't need them. And yet, if you took a closer look, these were the guys who were responsible in large part for the upkeep of the nuclear arsenal and other important things that should not be disregarded or pushed aside. But because of the sort of 30,000-foot top-down view, and because you have Elon Musk who wants to cut more and then fix in retrospect, we've seen this come out in his own companies where he's aggressive at first and then throttles back. You have to make some steps in the other direction. And I think that, that's maybe easier said than done at USAID, but maybe at Social Security, when people's lives are on the line, $2,000 might not sound like a lot in the grand scheme of things with the federal government, but for a retiree, that $2,000 is, whether or not they get to go see their grandkids. I think that, we may be tiptoeing around Armageddon or perhaps, other problems.
All right. We are going to leave it there. We're going to take another quick break and we'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this.
Welcome back to the show. I'm talking now with Tony Woodlief, who first-time guest for us, but I have a feeling won't be the last. Tony's got a very interesting story in the Wall Street Journal today. I've covered Tony. I've been covering Washington since Reagan was president. This story surprised me. I don't use words like deep state, very often, but this made me think there is an entrenched bureaucracy, and the Biden administration did everything it could to empower it before he left office. Tell our viewers and listeners a little more about it.
Sure, and thanks for having me talk about it, Carl. So it concerns an area of federal regulation that is underreported, and that's an instrument called guidance, which is any kind of communication that a federal agency sends out to, we'll call them regulated parties, which could be, it could be your state Medicaid office, it could be a private business, it could be people running your 4-H camps. It's any entity that could be subject to that federal agency's regulation or authority. They're going to get, over the course of a year, lots of pieces of communication called guidance, which is supposed to simply explain how the law works in plain language for people. It's supposed to be helpful. That's why
It's supposed to explain to a guy in an agency, let's say the Department of the Interior, what Congress meant when it passed a new law about, water use in the West.
Sure. Or
Yeah, right?
a great example, Congress a few years ago passed a law and they said to health insurers, look, if you're going to provide, in addition to medical care for physical conditions, any kind of behavioral health care, then the value of the care that you provide that is non-pharmaceutical, non-medical in terms of talk therapy or whatever, it needs to be commensurate. Well, my gosh, if you're an insurance company, what the heck does that mean? Like if we help people get into community groups to talk about their problems, that doesn't cost any money. Is it okay that we do that even though this drug costs $10,000? Does that still count as commensurate? So then they needed the federal government to say, yes, so they know what they're doing. They know that they're within the law. So fast forward, especially to the Obama years, agencies realized, you know what? We can send out these clarifications and really kind of quietly with a wink and maybe a raised fist, let the regulated party know, if you don't do it this way, we may come after you.
All right,
So
give a couple examples of that.
Sure, absolutely. One that the Obama people put out, and it was walked back, and then it was reissued by the Biden people last year. This was a piece of guidance that came jointly from Department of Education and Department of Justice, and it went to school administrators, so to our public schools. And they said, look, if you have different rates of suspension and expulsion between your white students, your African-American students, your Latino students, and so on, if we see any differences in those rates, you may have a team of Department of Justice lawyers fly into your district and give you an examination. And then the rest of the document was this long list of school districts where they did that. And lo and behold, every single time they flew into the school district, they discovered discrimination and enforced a consent decree. So
right, wait, let me stop you there for 1 second. I want to make sure our listeners understand. So what law were they allegedly giving guidance to? What did Congress done that required this directive to go out to?
Well, sure. Congress had passed a couple of different civil rights laws that, of course, rightly so, say you cannot discriminate on the basis of race in any kind of educational institution that's receiving federal funds.
All right, so that was an old law. There was nothing new going on.
No new law.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And so one thing was always clear in the application of that law, it was never supposed to be assumed that if you had different outcomes by race, that proved racism. That was just always part of the game until first the Obama administration and then again the Biden administration. They not so subtly said, we're going to assume that you are discriminating if there's a difference. So all the school districts got the message. Start looking at the race of the child before you make a suspension or expulsion decision, which is the opposite of what the civil rights laws were intended to do. Now you've got a de facto kind of quiet racism to make sure the numbers aren't out of whack. And that's just tip of the iceberg of how agencies misuse guidance. And so what happened in the first Trump administration was his Department of Justice walked this way back. And they said, from now on, for example, we can't use guidance documents in some kind of enforcement proceeding to say, well, you got this guidance document, so that means you understood our interpretation. And so since you didn't do it that way, you meant to break the law. So now we've proven intent to break the law. They're not allowed to do that. They were also supposed to, when they issued guidance, they were supposed to identify any guidance that was going to have a major cost for the rest of us to comply with it and get, extra approval from higher up in the agency before that guidance could go out. There were a number of constraints like that put on the use of guidance. And as soon as Biden took office, they got rid of all that. They did it through executive order, and then they did it through a different kind of rule change that made it more permanent. So the point of my op-ed was—
Wait, before we get to that,
sure.
You're listening to Tony Woodlief, who's got this op-ed in Wall Street Journal today. Tony, before you explain, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we have time. What happened recently, and or when Joe Biden was leaving office? Let me ask you one question that just comes to mind. Why didn't any of these school districts or states or cities just write a letter back and say to the Justice Department, your interpretation of this law has never been the understanding of the law. It's not in the congressional intent. We've looked at that. We reject your interpretation of the law and would thank you to leave us alone. How come nobody ever did that?
That would take a level of courage that I don't think you often find among the ranks of school administrators. And that's, I don't mean to sound unfair or callous. Their position, if you think about it from their point of view, they're subject to a board of directors, a school board. Imagine trying to explain to that school board, to the local reporters, to everyone else that some lawyers from the Department of Justice showed up to investigate you because they believe you're discriminating against children on the basis of race. You are guilty in the media, regardless of what happens. Your career could be over. So I think it's just a heck of a lot easier to begin to fudge the numbers, to try to find other ways to resolve the conflicts, which,
yeah, okay.
Done,
all right, you answered that. All right, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but go ahead. So when President Biden's leaving office, then what happens?
Well, this is what mystified me. I noticed this in the Federal Register 3 days before the Trump people took over. The Biden Department of Justice finalized this rule. They had already changed the practice. They threw out all the constraint on guidance that Trump had put in the first time. Then they made a sort of in-between kind of rule called an interim final rule. And that was it. It was settled. If nobody did anything, that would just be the rule until the Trump people came in and went through the whole process of changing a rule, which takes time. It could be litigated. But for some reason, 3 days before they leave town, they finalized the rule. And so my point in the op-ed is, well, we have this thing called the Congressional Review Act. And the whole point of it is Congress can review, especially with an incoming presidential administration, they can look over the stuff that was left behind for them by the previous administration. And if they want to, they can eliminate it. They can rescind it.
Yeah, well, you argued in the piece that by making it permanent, what the Biden administration did was really open this up to congressional oversight. Congress said, wait a minute, because now you're making it permanent. Now you're actually passing laws. We want to look at that. And you've got a Republican majority. It's very thin in the House, but it's still there. You have a Republican majority in the Senate. You got J.D. Vance and Donald Trump in office in the executive branch. So if these Republicans read your article and decide that this is not the way they want to go, they could do something about it.
They can. Now, well, they'll have to navigate a last little poison pill that was left for them by the Biden DOJ administrators. They classify this rule in a way that on paper means it's not eligible for congressional review. But it's very clear that they deliberately classified it the wrong way. And what they did in a nutshell is they took advantage of this little space in the law that says, okay, look, if the agency makes some change to how it does personnel and administrative matters, we don't need Congress to get involved in, changing the uniforms or changing how you do overtime. We'll exempt that stuff from congressional review. So they just pushed this thing under that label and said, well, this is just a matter of personnel and management. Well, it's not. It's a matter of empowering prosecutors from the Department of Justice to coerce people, either beforehand, because you know that they're going to get you in court, or once they have you in court. So it's a tremendous power that this regulation gives people that I don't think anyone would agree they should have, unless you're just a big fan of the administrative state.
Well, that's going to do it for us right now. Tony, please keep on this. If you write about it again, if the Wall Street Journal doesn't publish it, give me a call. We'll publish. I'd like to see the follow-up. I'd like to see where this story is going.
All right, I'll tell them they've got competition. Thank you.
Thanks again, Tony.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined by Sean Trende. He's our senior elections analyst. Sean, good to have you.
Great to be back.
All right. So let's talk about the Senate in 2026. So we got news last week that Tina Smith, Senator, Democrat from Minnesota, announced she is not going to run for re-election. This is the second. I believe Gary Peters in Michigan is the other Democrat who has said that he is not going to run for re-election. So we're going to have two Dem open seats. Obviously, Minnesota is probably a little bit more blue than Michigan is at this point. But I mean, how big of a deal is this? Is this a real problem for the Democrats and their chances to take back the Senate?
Minnesota, not so much. Michigan is a little bit of a headache. Look, Minnesota, what's happened in the Midwest is that Democrats have kind of hemorrhaged among rural voters, rural white voters in the Midwest, of whom there are generally a lot and who had kind of held on to their Democratic roots for a long time. Now that's not the case, and that really hurts them in a state like Wisconsin. The problem is that Minnesota has Minneapolis, and something like two-thirds of the votes in the state get cast in the Minneapolis metro area. It really dominates the state's politics, and so far it's offset the Republican trend that they're getting in the rurals, and just it keeps the state kind of tantalizingly out of reach for Republicans.
I saw some headline that said Tim Walz is actually thinking about maybe joining into that race. Um, is that a good idea? Do you think he'd be the prohibitive favorite just because he's so well known in the state now?
I think in a general election, he probably would be. Now, the one kind of caveat on all this is that there will be a primary. His lieutenant governor said she was going to run, kind of tried to get ahead of the Walsh train. Um, Angie Craig is a Democrat from the suburbs of Minneapolis, and she's exploring. And if you do get this badly divided field of kind of normie Democrats, if you will, it opens the chance that someone like Elon or someone well to the left of the state might squeak through with a small plurality. And that could make the race interesting.
Just sort of broadening the lens here, Sean, and looking at the map, they're really it's not a great map for Democrats. I mean, they're going to need 4 seats, right? It's 53-47 right now, so getting to 50-50 does not help them because JD Vance will still be the vice president. And you look, we've got basically 4 races that are considered toss-ups, and 2 of them Republican. We've got North Carolina and Maine. And then on the Democratic side, you've got Georgia with John Ossoff and the aforementioned Michigan. Those are going to be tough holds for Democrats, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, we just had an open race in Michigan with Trump on the top of the ticket and a good GOP environment that the Republicans couldn't convert. So I think that's one where you probably put a thumb on the scale for the Democrats to start. But that Georgia race is going to be a tough hold for Democrats, especially if Governor Kemp gets in, who, is one of the last of the Republicans who kind of have a foot in both camp of MAGA and normie Republicans. So yeah, it's tough. I mean, what Democrats I think really want is to get it down where Murkowski and Collins start to become relevant again, and they can have then they can start to hopefully, in their minds at least, gum up the works a bit in the Senate.
Well, let's talk about Susan Collins because she is a perennial target for Democrats, but an absolute survivor, always manages to beat the odds. Is she set up to do that again this year? Again, Trump's not going to be on the top of the ticket. And Democrats think that that's a place where they can win.
I mean, it's a blue state, right? Republicans haven't carried it for president since 1988, but at the same time, I think people get carried away with that. It's a blue state, but it's not Ohio. It's not a counterpart to Ohio or Montana, right? And so Collins probably has to run like 4 points ahead of Trump, where Trump was to win. That's doable. It's not a Herculean effort like I'm already forgetting the name of the governor of Maryland who couldn't pull it off, or Sherrod Brown or John Tester.
Larry Hogan.
Larry Hogan. I kept coming up with Larry Craig, and that's a very different Senate candidate. But yeah, it's going to be a tough hold. But she's a survivor. She ran 20 points ahead of John McCain in 2008, and Democrats thought they had her number in 2000, and she ended up winning with the majority of the votes. So you'd be foolish to write her off.
All right, last toss-up that we'll discuss is North Carolina. Tom Tillis. I mean, that's a state, that is trends more and more blue. Although Trump won it this time around. Again, is that a realistic opportunity for Democrats?
It's a weird state because they have carried the state once at the presidential level since 1992, barely in 2008. They've won one Senate election in recent years there, 2008 again with Kay Hagan. But they still win the governorship. They usually win a couple of the statewide races. The big question there is whether the governor of the state gets in. If Governor Cooper gets in, it's a really tough race for Tillis, who isn't anything special, right? He doesn't have a strong brand of his own. If Cooper does take a pass on it, well, I think you got to upgrade Tillis's chances significantly.
We're speaking with Sean Trende, Senior Elections Analyst for RealClearPolitics. We're talking about the 2026 Senate map and what it might mean for the Democrats' chances to retake the upper chamber. As I mentioned earlier, they will need a net gain of 4 seats to do that. So I guess the good news for Democrats is right now, we have listed 4 leaning Republican seats, Sean. We have one of those is Florida, which, Ashley Moody's running for official elections. She was appointed there, but that's been a very Republican state. Another one is you've got Ohio. John Husted is same thing, running for to finish out that term. John Cornyn in Texas and Joni Ernst in Iowa. You can remember not too long ago, she was the subject of some rumblings about a primary challenge because of the way that she was interacting with Pete Hegseth and his nomination. It looks like that might have passed. Give us what's your sense of those races? Are those realistic opportunities for Democrats in, what historically would be not a great year for Republicans?
I think what the Democrats are hoping for in most of those states is a messy primary. I mean, you're talking about states, I think all of them, that Donald Trump won by double digits. All of them except, the 3 Texas, I guess 2. Texas and Iowa have well-established incumbents. Florida, the senator is well respected. In Ohio, I think, Democrats are really banking on first Sherrod Brown running again and then Husted getting primaried by a MAGA type candidate. If that comes to pass, then I think it could get spicy, as they say. But, Husted is kind of in the tradition of establishment GOPers, the type of Republican that runs well in the state. So I'm not sure, even if Brown gets in, how vulnerable Husted would end up being.
And on the Democratic side, there are only 2 that we currently have rated as leans Democrat. We mentioned at the top of the show, Minnesota, the open seat now where Tina Smith is retiring, but also New Hampshire. Jeanne Shaheen is up for re-election. Are they vulnerable there, or is that a state that they should probably carry?
Yeah, if Shaheen retires, you could definitely see. I mean, Republicans have been competitive there in Senate races, and they haven't pulled it off, but they've had some tight races. I think what that comes down, like I said, is if Shaheen retires, and assuming Republicans then nominated a non-Don Balda type candidate to run for the seat. But otherwise, it's a small playing field. We should remember that in 2006, it didn't look like the Democrats had a chance. No one would have thought Virginia was competitive at the beginning of the cycle. Similarly in 2010, I think most of us thought at the beginning of the cycle that Democrats would probably expand their majority, given Republican retirements and whatnot. So there's still, I mean, we are in like the early stages of the preseason. Yeah.
Right. Any potential, again, with the caveat that it's very, very early and tough to tell. When you look at that map, are there any races on there that you're like, I'm going to keep an eye on this one because this could, New Mexico, Colorado, any places, you mentioned Virginia, any places where you're going to just have your sort of side eye working on that state?
Yeah, I would pay attention to Alaska if Peltola gets in. I mean, she did just lose re-election. Again, this is not, you don't want to get too carried away with it. And I think sometimes online election Twitter is like, oh, she gets in, it's a toss-up. No, it's still a state that is pretty Republican. But keep an eye on it. The other one is Virginia. If Warner were to retire and Youngkin were to get in, that would rocket up the charts pretty quickly.
All right. Well, obviously, we're going to be talking about this a lot. We got 2 years to do it, Sean. But thanks for the early look. We appreciate you, Sean Trende, Senior Elections Analyst for Real Clear Politics.
Thanks.
All right, and that's going to do it for us. On behalf of Carl and Phil, I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. We'll see you back here tomorrow night. Good night.